I'm Dan Arbell. I'm a scholar in residence here at the Center for Israel Studies at American University. And it's a great joy and privilege to be here today with a great group of panelists, top-notch, to unpack a subject which I don't know if you've been hearing anything about it, challenges to Israeli democracy and American democracy, and where U.S. Jews stand. So I don't know, it's kind of out of some really weird topic to discuss today. But seriously, of course, wherever you are, these are unprecedented times. And I don't think that the Israeli system and U.S. systems have faced such pressures and as they do before. And so we're going to get right to it. And you have the bios of the speakers in front of you, so I'm not going to read their impressive bios, just to introduce them from left to right. Michael Koplow from Israel Policy Forum, Becka Alper from Pew Research, Gadeer from, now she's a former member of Knesset and a advisor to companies, and Dahlia Scheindlin, who's a journalist and a researcher from Israel, writes for Haaretz and also 972 magazine. So, you know, we have a lot to cover, and I also want to, I have a whole list of questions, but I think that I'm going to start with a few questions, but then leave it for Q&A from the audience. To talk about the challenges democracy faces in both countries and where the U.S. Jewish community is in all of this. So maybe, Dahlia, let's start with you, and if you can kind of talk us through how you see, kind of give us a historical perspective up to nowadays, how you see Israeli democracy, the progress, or you know, the how it was pre-October 7th, post-October 7th, and the challenges that you see or the strains that you see that Israeli democracy faces nowadays. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for the question. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our hosts. It's a great question because the history of democracy before October 7th is quite long, and I think that there is a tendency to see everything as happening before, let's say, January 2023, when we, you know, the issue of Israeli democracy was put on the map, first of all, for Israelis who started to realize that it was under threat. And came out en masse to protest against the government's policies to constrain judicial independence. But of course, the history of the problems go way back, and I'd be grateful that I'm not taking you all the way back to early Zionism. But I will say that I think we tend to misdiagnose or misrepresent the history of democracy in Israel from the earliest stages of the founding of the country, at which I would argue Israel was at its least democratic in the earliest stages, right? In hindsight, from 2023, we look back and say we must get back to Israel's democratic roots. But in fact, those roots, or the foundation of democracy, in a way was missing from the start in one symbolic way, and that is a constitution, right? Now, as we all know, a constitution does not solve all the problems of a democracy, nor does it prevent severe challenges. But it is a symbolic signpost of where you want to go. What is your trajectory? And I think that, you know, Israel never really set out that signpost for itself. And there's another interesting document that you mentioned in our preliminary talk, which is the Declaration of Independence. And I think you had said something like, what was its purpose? Also an interesting entry point into this question. 2/3 of the Declaration of Independence lays out the history of the Jewish people and their connection to the land of Israel as the justification for the establishment of the land of Israel. There are about 2 paragraphs that are pretty brief, talking about the equality of all citizens. It does not mention the word democracy itself, but it is important that it mentions equality of all citizens, considering even citizenship could not be taken for granted at that stage, and talks about the members of the Arab nation, something that is heavily debated even today. However, the Declaration of Independence itself isn't really legally binding, and so it is a kind of normative signpost. And this brings me to the distinction between institutions, norms, and practices. So we have a missing foundation for the institutions, and that's the constitutional declaration of how these institutions should be designed in a way to both, guarantee rights, basic civil liberties and human rights in Israel, which is missing and happened piecemeal. The institutional piece means we don't have a clear vision for how the state should be structured, what are the limitations on the authority of the state, what's the balance of powers in a republic. All of that stuff on the institutional level evolves piecemeal, sometimes through court battles, putting the court in a difficult and sensitive position. And people expect to have democratic rights and equality, but it's not really guaranteed. In fact, to this day, there is no primary legislation in Israel guaranteeing equality of all citizens. Not only is there not constitutional legislation, there's not even a regular law guaranteeing equality of all citizens, only by implication, I should say. So at the institutional level, you have some missing foundations. At the level of the normative ideas about what democracy looks like, for the Jewish population, you have a very strong normative understanding, right? There should be democracy. We will participate at high rates in elections. We expect to have a model democracy. Israel has been telling itself about this model democracy from the very beginning. And yet, of course, that normative understanding is not really shared by the Arab population or the Palestinian citizens of Israel because they have not experienced it. So I'm talking about the early stages still. So there's not really any expectation, there's not a perception that Israel is a democracy from those earliest stages. And that brings me to the third aspect of democracy, which is, or any system, which is what is the practice? What is the actual practice on the ground? After you look at the institutions, the normative vision, and the practice, you see that, well, there's a reason why the Palestinian citizens of Israel didn't have a normative vision of Israel as a democracy, because they were living under martial law from the very beginning for about 20 years. And Israel, it's not, I think we always have to look at this not only as the people who are the subjects of undemocratic regimes, but the people who are doing them. So Israel, the Israeli state itself, through the military government, is putting into practice fundamentally undemocratic institutional regime, an institutional regime. And the moment that goes away, you have the start of a new undemocratic regime after 1967. That's the occupation, which in the beginning one might think was, an outcome of the war, possibly temporary for years, even a couple of decades, but which has become a permanent fixture of Israeli life. And so in practice, there has always been very significant practice that runs counter to democratic principles. So at the level of institutions, norms, and practice, we're starting from a very, tenuous starting point, which is why I think Israel was particularly vulnerable to both the debates and the controversies over the role of the court, right, which ultimately, turned into this really aggressive attack on the court, but which had been building for about 15 years before that, and yet took Israeli society by surprise. That was all before October 7th. October 7th happens, and like most wars, it's an opening to constrain further democratic principles, whether it's through chipping away at civil liberties, through emergency legislation, using the fog of war to make a whole series of political appointments to try to replace the professional levels of government, and eventually the government has gone back to trying to pass some of the more significant pieces of legislation in its original package from January 2023 that had been kind of put on hold briefly. So, the situation is really, I think, more vulnerable than it's ever been, but the foundations were weak to begin with, and that's one of the reasons for those vulnerabilities.
So thank you for setting the stage. It's very, very helpful. And Gadeer is a former member of Knesset, member of the Druze community. How do you define Israeli democracy, and what do you see the strains that it faces in general and today?
First, thank you, Dan. Glad to be here today with you. I am listening to you, my friend. I agree. Sorry not to bring great news this morning, but I am not that optimistic. I am here to provide accurate reality as we have it, and believe me, you don't have to be a political expert or to study international relations or politics to understand that Israeli democracy now in a crucial momentum in a challenging period of time. As you know, my friends, we have no constitution yet, but still we succeeded to maintain a healthy balance between our two major components of our identity as the state of Israel, between being a Jewish state and a democracy. Since our establishment, it worked very well. But in recent years, we see attempts in many levels, as you mentioned, to try to redefine or to bring us a new identity of the State of Israel, emphasizing more the Jewishness or the Jewish character of the State of Israel rather than the democratic character, emphasizing nationalism rather than liberalism. And I want to focus on two major components or foundations of any democracy that have been challenged recently. One of them, the value of equality. As we mentioned, the Declaration of Independence, go please and read chapter 13. Our founders, they said and wrote, Israel must ensure complete, equal rights to all of its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Where are we now? If we go back to recent years, go back with me to 2017, the Knesset legislated draconic series of legislations against or targeting the non-Jewish community. Kamenetz law. Please study Kamenetz law. Israel woke up in 2016 realizing that there are more than 100,000 illegal buildings of them. The majority, 75%, are in the Arab community. Instead of understanding the core of the problem, why it's happening, because of the problematic comprehensive urban planning, lack of manpower, lack of budgets, it tried to solve it, in quotes, with demolition orders, with bills. A year after, 2018, we had the nation-state law. As we mentioned, no constitution. We have several basic laws that are going to form the future, the constitution in the future. And the nation-state law is our identity as the State of Israel. It's our opening chapter. And it's saying that Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people, which we know, that's right. But the country refusing to ensure equality for all of its inhabitants, which is something that as a former MK, a former member of Knesset, I tried to fix. We tried to make that important amendment twice, and we couldn't succeed. I worked with A-list jurists in Israel, Bar Ilan universities, with the right wing to say, hold your horses, take a deep breath. Ensuring civil equality wouldn't create any damage to the Jewishness or the Jewish character of the State of Israel, but we didn't succeed. So you see that the value of equality has been challenged recently. Another core foundation of a democracy, the rule of the law. No one is above the law. Democracy is not the rule of the people, it's the rule of the law. And that has been challenged recently in different layers. The recent one, look what was happening last week. A sudden letter from President Trump to President Herzog asking to grant a full pardon for Netanyahu, describing the cases as political, as unjustified, and we would say, excuse me. Israel enjoyed and declared proudly since its establishment that we are a superpower, we are a democratic state. Israel put in jail in 2011 its president, Katsav. Israel put in jail in 2016 its prime minister, Alper. Reminding ourselves, in 1977, our former prime minister, Rabin, decided to resign after we discovered that his wife, not him, opened a US bank account with a few amount of dollars. It was then against the law. And he decided, respecting the law, because as a leadership, the essence of leadership, to resign. So suddenly you see a campaign to try to help our prime minister, but this is the essence of leadership. We must investigate. We are talking about a topic that is attracting global attention, that we have been dealing with since 2016. The course started in 2020, and it's still ongoing. And the process is working totally different. As you know, you need to submit an official request. It should be done after the verdict, not during the trial, after admitting. So we are asking ourselves, it's raising great questions, massive concerns about legal questions, moral questions. What's happening to us? Who are we, the State of Israel? Do we trust our Supreme Court, which is, by the way, one of the strongest in the world? So beyond that case, we see questions regarding legislations. Dan, I don't know if you saw recently Sivan Harmelech introducing a law to bring much more power to the Knesset committee that is controlled by the government to delay any process of investigating a current prime minister. And you ask yourself, you see so many legislations or attempt to legislate to give much more power to the legislative entity and to weaken our other entity and to redefine the balance or the relationship, the checks and balances in Israel. And then you ask ourselves, if we seek to survive in next century as the state of Israel, we need to ask tough questions. Who are we the state of Israel? Are we a Jewish state? Are we a democratic state? By the way, I believe we can be both. With brave leadership, we can maintain this healthy balance, but we need tough questions and brave leadership.
Thank you very much. Michael, you have the vantage point of being here in the U.S. and also having spent a lot of time in Israel, knowing both countries pretty well. There's often this saying that the shared values of Israel and the U.S., both being resilient democracies and so on and so forth, arguing about the similarities of both democracies. And I wanted to ask how you see these two democracies side by side or interacting with one another, and just similarities and differences.
So, like Dahlia, I'm also a political scientist. So a lot of what I say is gonna build on what Dahlia said. So there certainly are commonalities between democracy in the United States and in Israel, and I think we're also seeing some commonalities in the challenges. In both places, we have the rise of populism, largely right-wing populism, that is challenging some of the institutions and norms and causing issues in both democracies. But I think largely what we have are differences, and it's because the institutions and the systems are very different. So here in the United States, we don't actually, in my opinion, have a problem of institutional design. We have a constitution that has set out very clear 3 branches of government. These 3 branches all have very clear powers. It's up to the courts to decide some of the balance, but we have a good sense of what each branch is supposed to do. What is the president's job? What is Congress's job? What is the job of the courts? And can some of this be tweaked? Could some of it be done differently? Sure. But the problem that we face now is not that these institutions are necessarily designed in a weak way. The problem that we face is that there's one institution trying to amass more power, and another institution, Congress, that's supposed to be a check, that's simply declining to operate as a check, even though they have the power to do so. It's not a problem of the design. It's a problem of choices that are being made by members of Congress. So when the president says, hey, I want to do this thing that is normally in Congress's purview, rather than Congress objecting, Congress is saying, okay, fine, go ahead, we're not going to object. That's a different issue than having a design problem. And in Israel, what we have is a design problem. Aside from the fact that there is no constitution, as both Dahlia and Gadeer pointed out, and that is a huge issue, especially because you have this quasi-constitution, this thing called a system of basic laws that are supposed to act as a constitution, but they're not really treated different from other legislation. They don't require a higher threshold to pass. There's no real, aside from real procedure for making them different, there's no real sense other than custom that they're supposed to be treated differently. Excuse me. So you have this issue of design. And then on top of it, unlike here, where we have the executive branch and we vote for that, and then we have the legislative branch and we vote for that, and they're separate things. In Israel, you often hear people talk about 3 branches of government, but it's not entirely true, because you vote for the Knesset, and the majority that gets formed in the Knesset then gets to form the government, which is the executive. So you basically have the same group of people who control the legislature, the Knesset, and then control the executive in the form of the government, meaning the prime minister and all the other ministries. So in Israel's design itself, you don't really have much of a check from one institution to another because it's the same people and they're coming from the same bodies. And then on top of that, when you have the court system, as we know from just watching the fights from the last 3 years of the judicial overhaul, the powers of the Supreme Court in Israel have not always been what they are now. It's developed over time, and it's somewhat through custom, it's somewhat through norms, it's somewhat through one huge figure, Aharon Barak, who when he was president of the Supreme Court was very smart and savvy about the way he increased the court's powers. But it's not something that's really written down or that's accepted by everybody, or like here in a constitution where we would say, all right, we may not like it, but it's a constitution. What can we do about it? And so it makes everything in Israel far more tenuous. And it's why before October 7th, during the judicial overhaul, you would see a majority of Israelis who said, we don't like what the government is doing. We don't like this judicial overhaul. We think that it's wrong in all sorts of ways. But you had a larger majority of Israelis who said there has to be some sort of judicial overhaul. It wasn't this baked-in idea that somehow the judiciary was right and the government was wrong. So all of these things are much more in flux. And so when you have a situation like this where the institutions themselves their powers are not well set out, and in some ways it's almost structured for one branch to really dominate things without a check, you're going to inevitably have these issues of democratic backsliding and democratic deterioration. And when so much is built on this idea of unity, or this idea of mamlachtiyut, I'll put in my Shalom Hartman Institute hat for a moment and say that on last week's podcast, Yehuda Kurtzer, who's sitting here, interviewed Tani Frank, and they talked about this issue of mamlachtiyut. So much of democracy in Israel, this idea of stateliness, right? That you're supposed to do things for the benefit of the state. When your democracy in many ways rests on that idea, if not everybody accepts that idea, then you're in trouble. And so, I think what we see here is people poking at the cracks, right? And really probing the weak spots. Whereas in many ways, I think the Israeli system is one entire weak spot. And so without a constitution, or even without a basic law and legislation that will be a basic law that says how you pass basic laws, I think that the Israeli system is going to keep on running into these issues.
Thank you very much. Becka, you're from Pew Research, and your expertise is minorities and looking at the social fabric of America, and especially looking at American Jews. And I wanted to ask you if you can kind of talk about the issue of minorities, the treatment of minorities, and also American Jewry as a minority and its perspective.
Is this on? Yes? Great. Yeah, so I can give some context about views of minorities in the U.S. and also a little bit about what Jewish Americans are thinking and feeling in the past few years. So one thing we found, we did a survey in April of 2025 where we asked Americans to just kind of evaluate how much discrimination various groups face in the U.S. today. And we asked about 20 different groups. And towards the top of the list were immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally, people who are transgender, Black people, Muslims, Hispanic people, Jews, and people who are gay and lesbian. And so Jews are amongst the top of that list that we find. And we see for this that there's partisan differences going on in terms of how people evaluate discrimination. So, for example, Republicans are more likely to say that white people or evangelical Christians, men or religious people face more discrimination relative to Democrats. But Democrats, for the other 16 groups, are more likely to say those other 16 groups face more discrimination. So in terms of how groups are viewed, there's definitely differences there by partisanship, which probably doesn't seem all that surprising to folks. One thing we also see is that the share of Americans who say that Jews have experienced at least some discrimination has declined over the past year. So basically so we asked about this question a few different times, and we saw that before October 7th, the share of Jews were kind of at a certain point, and then it kind of peaked up a bit immediately after the war. Not immediately, but like within the past, or like 5 months afterwards, as it did for a little bit for Muslim Americans. But the last time we asked about this a few months ago, it dropped some. But it also dropped some for people's evaluations of Muslim Americans and perhaps maybe also evangelical Christians. It's kind of hard to see. But so you see that broadly, views of discrimination against groups are higher for Jews, but ticking downward a little bit. Now, for how Jews feel in the U.S., we asked about this most recently in February of 2024, and we asked about some of those same groups, so Jews, Muslims, Arab Americans, a few others, and we find that Jewish Americans, the majority say that Jews face at least some discrimination in the U.S., and this was kind of a different thing than what we found before. So when we did our 2013 survey of American Jews and also our 2020 survey of American Jews, we found that Jews tended to rate some other groups, Muslims, Black people in the U.S., as experiencing more discrimination than Jews themselves. And this time when we asked about it in February 2024 is the first time that Jews put themselves as experiencing more discrimination than other groups. And we see, kind of like with the public overall, we see partisan differences there, where Jewish Democrats tend to look like Democrats overall in terms of views of discrimination against various groups, and Republicans tend to look more like, Republican Jews tend to look more like Republicans overall in terms of views about discrimination about various groups. And the other thing I'll say is in that same 2024 February survey, we found that Jewish Americans were more likely, or a lot of Jewish Americans said that discrimination against Jews went up since October 7th. And Democratic Jews were more likely to say this for Muslims and Arab people as well, relative to Republican Jews. And the last thing I'll say for like context in the US in terms of views of minority groups is we've asked kind of a version of a question of kind of evaluating sentiment towards various religious groups a few different ways. Over the years. Sometimes we've done it as asking people to rate various religious groups on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is like the coolest feelings and 100 is the warmest feelings. We call it a feeling thermometer. Most recently in 2022, we asked about it kind of as favorability questions. Do you have favorable or unfavorable views towards various religious groups? And no matter which way we've asked it, Americans tend to evaluate Jews among more positively relative to other religious groups. So when we ask about, 6 or 7 groups over the years, Jews tend to be evaluated amongst the most positively. And so that's kind of like the context for Jewish Americans right now, at least in terms of the data we have in the past few years.
Thank you. Dahlia, could you also speak about treatment of minorities in Israel and how the Jewish, non-Jewish divide impacts democracy, politics, and so on?
Yeah. I would rephrase it. I don't think there is treatment of minorities per se in Israel. I think what there is a distinction between Jews in Israel, who are present, 71.8% of the population, and Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is how Israelis view the minority question. They're really not that focused on other minorities. And there are some other minorities, right? We have about 500,000 who are categorized as others, others being people who are not Jewish but also not Arab. And they come from different backgrounds. But the Central Bureau of Statistics lately has been doing an awful lot of work to try to conflate the other category with the Jewish category, because that way you get to 78%. And really, they're making it very hard to find the information on just Jews, which is just a contrast to the past, where they were always proud of how many Jews there are in Israel. But never mind. So the point is, if you're looking at the minority, right, really, when Israelis often don't even talk about Arabs. They talk about members of the minority community, b'nei mi'utim, right? Or non-Jews, right. So that's really what they're referring to. And, this goes back to, again, a chapter that I think is often either left out or very much underestimated in terms of its importance in Israeli life, which is the first 20 years in which that minority, which was about 15% of citizens of Israel, were living under martial law regime. And that was holdover colonial laws. So when we talk about the question of whether Israel should be looked at through theoretical colonial frameworks, we don't have to go to theory. We actually had British mandate colonial martial law implemented as the regime for governing citizens of Israel. Okay, that ended in a 2-year phase out from 1966 to 1968. So you would think, well, in many ways that was progress, right? Israel moves towards greater levels of both democratization and eventually liberalization too over the years. And that includes advances for the minorities' rights, right? Arab, Palestinian. I use both terms because in survey research, that community uses both terms. So I don't want to choose for anybody. The breakdown is almost even. It goes back and forth, majority, minority, who use that term Palestinian or Arab. So I try to just use both. And that community becomes a little more free to mobilize, right? So there's more political activity, more political parties, more ideological diversity in those parties, and also greater demands for their own rights or pushing back on government policies. But I would say that the main issue is that the reaction of the Israeli state and government to those demands, that increasingly citizen-driven demand for either equality or rights, is always more draconian than it is to the reaction against or in the reaction to Israeli Jews who are becoming more mobilized over the course of the same period of time. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, Israel is on an upward liberal trajectory, largely driven by citizens. But just the examples of the contrast is that when Jews demonstrate, for whatever it is, various civil liberties or human rights or peace, they may be met with derision, they may be met with, very occasional kind of constraints, but minimal. One of the most important mobilizations of the Arab community in the 1970s, protesting against Israel's land distribution policies, was met with violence. And so, a number of citizens were killed, a situation that was repeated in the beginning of the Second Intifada when you had demonstrations of Arab citizens. The police opened up with live fire and killed 13. That's a very fresh trauma. We don't really have parallels with one exception, one Jewish citizen killed in a peace demonstration in the 1980s. In the beginning of the war after October 7th, when I talked about how the war became typically for many countries, a situation where you have emergency law and constraints on civil liberties, one of the first things that happened was that the police banned demonstrations against the war in the Arab community, not in the Jewish community. The Supreme Court upheld that ban, okay? It's a difference of treatment always. It was Palestinian or Arab citizens who were called in for hearings that threatened their jobs or fired from their jobs or arrested for Facebook posts, criticizing the war on some level. In numerous cases that are too numerous to go through here. So you do have, progress on the one hand relative to the early years, but it's almost entirely driven by citizens, and those activities are often met with greater pushback and constraints, and that leads me to a final point with relation to the role of the courts. Citizens in Israel have learned over the years that the law is not going to provide the civil liberties, human rights, or progress or equality that they need. So many of these battles are taken to court by citizens, and somebody mentioned that the court is one of the strongest in general, but I would sort of modify that and say the court has been put into this role by the lack of that institutional basis or legislation guaranteeing equality. Citizens have come to realize that's the only place they can go. They have put the court in that role. The Knesset and the government have put the court in that role by neglecting to advance the kind of institutional grounding for citizens to demand equality, et cetera. And as a result, there's an image of that the court has so much power and that the court has taken that power. I would push back on that a little bit or modify it, let's say, especially the personalized role. This is just a tweak on what you said. And I did want to mention it unrelated to the question, which is that there's an effort of this government to personalize everything that's wrong in Israel, as if these individuals are responsible for some sort of a coup, a deep state, if you will. And Aharon Barak was, for many years, at the center of that attack. He's been upstaged now by the Attorney General and the Military Advocate General more recently, in the eyes of the government who want to blame these people for an unelected coup. But Aharon Barak, certainly, was definitely a critical figure in interpreting the court's role in an activist way. But he was preceded by his mentor, the former president of the Supreme Court, or what we would call in America the Chief Justice, Meir Shamgar, who actually really expanded the activism of the court. And let's go back even further, right? In 1956, the court ruled against the government in a significant ruling guaranteeing freedom of media in Israel, because there was no freedom of media guaranteed, and there still isn't. That's a ruling against the executive branch. In 1969, the court for the first time ruled against legislation, not setting down a precedent, but doing it. There was always a need for an activist court, even if it was more limited, because of these gaps in the institutional basis. And that's why, to get to your question of how the Arab minority has worked, they've had to follow the same path of taking matters into their own hands to try to advance their rights institutionally, through the courts often, and certainly meeting with different treatment from the Israeli authorities in response, and leading to a situation where there has been, certainly progress relative to the early years, but also becoming the scapegoat for a populist narrative of an internal, the enemy from within, right, which is always exacerbated by the conflict and occupation, and certainly after October 7th, even more so. So it's a very precarious situation.
Thank you. Gadeer, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the topic.
We are not naive, Dan. We are enough intellectually mature to understand that the current Israeli public opinion or attention is less to discuss, or to understand the importance of minority rights. Some would say that now we are heading into the PTSD process, that now after the return of our hostages, by the way, there are still now the discussion is that this is not a deceased remains of, so 2 or 3 is still there, but now that we are starting digesting the trauma as a collective, as a national trauma. So the current situation now that we are acting out of fear, we are still in the process of grieving as a nation. It reignited the most traumatic experience that we had last century, the Holocaust, when we said, never again, by the way, to Palestinians too. It reignited the most traumatic experience they had last century, the Nakba. So we are talking about 2 traumatized nations, but specifically when we talk about us Israelis, we are still in the PTSD process, less attention about, okay, how Arab Israelis or Arab Palestinians now feel about the state or the sense of belonging to the state. And if you understand Hebrew, I really encourage you to dive into social media. Go to social media. For me, it's the most authentic, accurate way to measure public opinion. Go to comments, read comments. What? No, for me, I always laugh with my husband. You don't have to be political expert. When there is anything related to Arabs, go to social media, read comments. Burn them all, finish the job, burn their villages, all of them. And the problem is somehow that for some Israelis, Arab Israelis, the 20% of non-Jewish community that living in Israel, it's still somehow considered as part of the broader regional Arab community or nations. Somehow they are still the enemy, still. And in its psychological way of thinking that we, human beings, we tend to do something called sorting. We tend to be together with people who hold similar opinions, values, and then we do the othering, we and they. And somehow the others are, in that case, the Arabs, that we are more sophisticated, more educated. They are the enemies. And we do much more. We limit even consuming data to confirm our own biases, beliefs. So all that process that happened, by the way, in a very organic way, it's about human behavior, it is much more deepening when you have up-bottom influence of a government that is leading systematic policy through legislation, through behavior, let's say, that is deepening that polarization. By the way, I totally agree with Dahlia that in Israel, when we talk about minorities, it is very clear, very like you have a dichotomy. We have Jews, we have non-Jews. Even listen to the terminology. Me, myself, was fixing speeches of leaders in Israel that would say, we care about Jews and non-Jews. I said, okay, don't define me by saying I am non-something, because in that way you are making kind of a hierarchy, that there is Jews and there are non-Jews. And by the way, in that non-Jewish or Arab or minority section, it's not a homogeneous sector. You have Christian, Muslims, Druze, and there are subsectors, Bedouins, Circassians. So you need to dive more and to have the willingness, the maturity to educate yourself to understand these minorities. And there are so many anecdotes of symbols to understand where is the attention currently in Israel. And for me, one of the tools to measure that, terminology. You know, when Israel Katz was appointed last year in November 24, one of his first steps was to cancel...
Minister of Defense.
sorry, what I said?
Said he's Stratocrat, you didn't say who he was.
Minister of Defense. Yeah, he was
Not a
appointed
lot of people know who he is, so it's important.
I don't know if this, okay. In November 24, one of his first steps was to cancel the administrative detention, which led to that unprecedented increase of violence and violent attacks of settlers against Palestinians. You should see how it's called when we talk about terminology among Israeli media. They are mitparaim, they are vandalists, they are not terrorists. Although if you go to the definition of terror, the essence of terror, they are terrorizing innocent families. They are killing, burning. This is Jewish terror. But even Channel 12, the most liberals, lefties, center, call it as you wish, they are very sensitive of how to call them. More than that, media, how media, and now as in other hat, as a former journalist, how media in Israel is treating Arab topics. When you have an opening item, one day an Arab Israeli child was kidnapped. It was not an opening item. Think about it. So there are so many layers and symbols and proofs and examples and data and numbers to explain that we are not there yet. The solution, collective maturity, political, intellectual maturity, but I am afraid we are not there yet. It requires very deep soul searching. We need brave leadership, but I am afraid we need, if October 7th didn't succeed to bring us to the understanding that having minorities thriving, closing the gaps, is for our interest, so there is so much work that should be done still.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to weigh in on this topic? Like looking at both countries, and yeah, please.
Sure. Just to build on Gadeer's point about administrative detention, in the last week you have in Israel an effort to introduce a death penalty bill for nationalist terrorism. It's a bill that's introduced by Itamar Ben-Gvir and his party Otzma Yehudit. And they're jumping through hoops to make sure that if this bill is passed, it will be clear that it only applies to Palestinian terrorists, not to Jewish terrorists, because obviously there is plenty of Jewish terrorism in the West Bank that is nationalist terrorism against Palestinians, including some that takes the lives of Palestinians. But if you pass a death penalty bill and you're Itamar Ben-Gvir, you have to make sure that it only applies to a very specific subset of terrorists, not the ones on your side. And so, we see these distinctions. I think that the previous panel, was discussing gaps in understanding between Israeli Jews and American Jews. And I think that the issue of minorities is one where we see this all the time. Here in the United States, we American Jews are 2% of the population. We are a very clear minority, and it's led to a historic concern with minority rights because it impacts us. And we've also learned over our centuries here that we can't only be concerned with our own minority rights. We have to be concerned with the rights of minorities writ large, because when people start coming from minorities, oftentimes it's going to be Jews that they come for first. And so, we've spent centuries here trying to make sure that minority rights are protected across the board because of the position we're in. And I think it leads many American Jews to look at what's happening in Israel and to recognize that there's a problem because we see it. Now, in some ways, it also, I think, distorts the picture because it leads a lot of American Jews to look at everything going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an issue of minority rights. And I think, in my opinion at least, that's a good way to classify what's happening with Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel. I think it's more complicated when we talk about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, where we're talking about much more of a nationalist conflict than one about majority-minority rights, even as things do bleed over. But for Israeli Jews, this is not nearly so easy because they aren't a minority. They are, as Dahlia said, 71% of the country. They don't have this frame. Much harder for them to understand. And so, we talk about minority rights here, and I think a lot of times it just goes past Israelis because they don't have this firsthand experience And when we talk about addressing minority rights here versus addressing minority rights in Israel, it's oftentimes very difficult to have this conversation because of this big difference in our histories and our position and the way we understand what it means to be a minority.
Thank you. Becca, do you want any follow-up on what was said? Or all right. So I'd like to take this at this point to open it up for audience questions, and you'll be getting a microphone, and I kind of ask if you can say who you are, your name, and just make sure that you're brief and that there's a question mark at the end of your statement, and not just making a speech or comments. So please, yes, please, the gentleman here in the black suit. Wait, microphone. Who you are, and if you can ask. Yeah.
My name is Ed Abrahams. I'm unaffiliated. I especially wanted to thank Gadeer for your comments, and I wondered if you could explore more deeply the situation of the Druze in Israel, and looking forward to the future, how the Arab parties are likely to perform in the next election.
Interesting. Thank you. Excellent question, because, 23 was a tough year for us Israelis. Even in January, when our Minister of Justice, Levine, introduced in that famous press conference the overhaul, the judicial, someone would call it revolution, some would call it reforms, it caught us in a way that we were already very tired as a collective. We were suffering from political instability. 5 elections in 4 years affected our economy, our social resilience. It took people to the streets on every Shabbat, almost for 39 Saturdays, everywhere. Very active discussions about who are with the state of Israel. So we were very polarized, Jews, Arabs, right, left, pro-Netanyahu, against Netanyahu, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, and then we had October 7th. So from a polarized society, we had October 7th that had positive impact on us for a short term. Among Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Arabs, anyone would define it, among Arabs, the Israel Democracy Institute, they had an interesting poll, November the 8th. A month post-October 7th, a peak moment of national security that Arabs in Israel felt connected more than ever to the state of Israel. Why? Because on October 7th, 25 Arabs were killed, /kidnapped, /injured, and it didn't help them, the fact that they were Muslims. Some of them, they were begging for their life, reading chapter from Quran, I am your brother. They were sniped and killed simply because they were Israeli citizens. So it led them to come toward the consensus, the Israeli identity. By the way, on the other hand, the ultra-Orthodox, same. 30% post-October 7 said we support drafting into army, 30%. But from that peak moment of national unity, do you know how much time it lasted? Guess what? Polls, numbers, dates. 6 weeks. Realignment, polarization. Then the ultra-Orthodox sector, hold your horses, it's against of our core values. Then the Arab community in Israel saw what's happening in Gaza, the humanitarian crisis, attracting global attention. They felt, okay, let us think again about our connectivity to the state of Israel. And you see in a very beautiful way, realignment of polarized society. Specifically, the Druze people is a special case. The loyalist minority, a successful, beautiful, modern way of an integration of a minority in a state, that we are Israelis more than Israelis. I speak Arabic as a mother tongue. I broadcasted it in 2 languages, but I took half a year private lessons in order to speak Arabic, the official Arabic, because we think and dream in Hebrew. Druze Israelis. So for us, and now we have, unfortunately, so much database. We had 5 elections in 4 years. You see that Druze Israelis, they vote center-right, 85% of them. They are connected to the state. They are Israelis more than Israelis. And even it helped us in the PR, in the GR, government relations, as a minority to negotiate or to leverage or to emphasize the unique, strong relationship that we built as Jews and Druze. before the establishment of the state, and to say, do you know what, go beyond. When we had the crisis in Syria in July, when our Druze brothers and sisters were slaughtered and killed and massacred, we say the state of Israel, the government must put its pressure to save them as a continuation of the commitment to them and to protect all Druze in the region. So it's fascinating to see how much it's rapid and changing the effect of October 7th on public opinion, how it brought us to align. We share same destiny, same values, but then we see realignment. Who knows what's next? It seems like counting down to another chapter with Iran or Lebanon, election in 26, let's see. You are asking about Arab parties. Abbas, not Mahmoud Abbas. By the way, Mahmoud Abbas celebrated his 90th birthday last week. But Mansour Abbas, for me, I believe he is a brave, fresh symbol of Arab leader in Israel by bringing the voices of Arabs who say, do you know what, we had this conflict, enough is enough, let us think about constructive ways or meaningful discussions as Arab within the state of Israel, in the government. So probably I believe he is going to pass the threshold by all polls, by every channel. Who knows if we see new voices? Sami Shhada is not passing. We will see maybe new voices, but the leading voice in the next election will be led by Mansour Abbas. Let us follow.
Thank you. This gentleman here, yes, right there.
Thanks very much for your presentation. My name is Michael Kraft, and in an earlier career, I've covered both Congress and the British Parliament, and I want to take up a design question that you all raised. To what extent do you think the proportional representational system in Israel has been a flaw in dealing with both legislation and policy? For example, the influence of minority, almost splinter parties, the right wing, both in the Gaza situation and the question of conscription for the ultra-Orthodox. I mean, I realize that both in Congress and Parliament, there are factions within the major parties, but it strikes me that the Israeli system, with the relatively low threshold, I think slower than Germany, which was a model, has been a major factor in some of the difficulties. I'd like to get your opinions.
Dahlia, would you like to?
Sure.
Proportional representation.
Yeah, it's a very good question. For those who don't know, Israel does have a pure proportional representation system, one constituency. There's no regional breakdown. We have, as a result, a unicameral parliament. So there's not even two chambers. So in addition to the lack of a real separation between the executive and the legislature only has one chamber. So this is a question that you're, no offense, but you're not the first to raise it. Israelis, generations of Israeli election analysis, political analysts, constitutional scholars, et cetera, have thought about this, and there have been efforts to reform that system over the years. I will say that as somebody who also works within the political system as an advisor and as a political scientist, I have tended to agree with the school of thought that actually electoral reform is not going to resolve the tensions that lead to all the problems that you mentioned. And how do we know this? A, because we've tried electoral reform over the years. We have tried to reform the system. The electoral threshold for getting into parliament has been raised over time. It used to be as low as 1%. It's now as high as 3.25%. So maybe not as high as, Turkey, which has, I think, 5% or 10%.
They are working to lower the threshold.
And they want to lower it again. And but more than that, I think even before we raised the electoral threshold, the more dramatic, at that time, one of the first major efforts at electoral reform was in the late 1990s, early 1990s, separating the vote for party from the vote for prime minister, which for reasons that are a little bit obscure to me now, the lawmakers at the time thought would reduce the number of parties, and actually had the opposite effect. And everybody says this like it's shocking, but it seems obvious to me because my first vote in Israel, after I moved there, was in 1999, and naturally I said, I can get the best of both worlds. I can vote for the candidate that I want for prime minister and a totally different party for the Knesset, and as a result, the number of parties just grew. So it's more like whatever the institutional, the electoral design, Israelis have a political culture, a very kind of amorphous term, where they believe they should have a party that is perfectly tailored, like a suit, you know, to how they. So what you often hear Israelis saying is, you know, there's nobody to vote for, and this is despite the fact that we have 30 to 40 parties running in every election. Now, usually about 8 to 13 will get into parliament, which is still a great deal of parties. And so I think that unless you had a complete overhaul of the electoral system, it will take more than one reform, you know, piecemeal, to change the culture of Israelis feeling like they need many, many different parties to represent them, which leads to the situation where you never have an electoral majority for one party. You always need party coalitions with anywhere between 4 and 8 parties in the coalition, and that leaves them very vulnerable to collapse, and that leads to instability. So I think, you know, ultimately what it means is that tiny little parties have a great deal of disproportionate leverage, right? So we live in a meritocracy, but it's not even, a minoritocracy on some level, which of course the government is trying to change to a majoritocracy. But the minoritocracy element is that these tiny parties can have a huge amount of leverage, except it's not an equal minoritocracy because of the long history of not having Arab parties in the governing coalition. So the only real minoritocracy is for the ultra-Orthodox parties or the small national religious parties. And they have disproportionate power relative to their size in the population. Not everybody remembers this, but you know, the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel is still not more than about 13%, 12 or 13%. You know, the national religious population is a little bit more, 13, 14%. Together, they're barely a quarter of the population. Of the total population, it's not even quite 1/4. And yet, think of how much tremendous power they have in the Israeli government. So it would certainly take more than just, you know, changing the proportional representation system, although what I really think we need is a list of institutionalized checks and balances, and you know, changing the pure PR system to one in which you have regional representation, for example, or possibly 2 chambers of parliament is more dramatic. We need a series. And if you look at all of the typical institutional checks and balances in liberal democracies, Israel is really the only country that has almost none of them. Institutionally, we have custom, right? But the only real institutional checks and balances we have are an independent judiciary and regular, if not too regular, elections. So we need lots of reform, but that would take a constitutional, you know, outlook, vision, which the country has never really been able to do because it doesn't want to answer those fundamental questions. What does it mean to be a Jewish state? You know, how does being a Jewish state coexist with democracy? Can it? What is the position of equality? What is the relationship between religion and state? Which really means, where does authority come from? Does it come from the people, or does it come from God? And Israel doesn't want to answer these questions.
Thank you. So I failed to mention that there are quite a few students here, and which I'm very happy about, and I wanted to give any of them the opportunity to ask a question. Yes, please. And then we'll go.
Hello. First of all, thank you all for coming. My name is Jack Bossart. I'm a student here at American, member of Professor Brenner's History of Israel class. And I had a question for Michael and for Dahlia, about, you know, you were talking a lot about, you know, democracy in Israel, how to preserve it, the history of democracy and democratic values, and particularly liberalism. But something that, you know, seemingly isn't necessarily as clear as it is in the United States is, you know, civilian oversight of the military, where it seems in the Israeli political system, you have to have a certain level of exposure or association with the military. How does this affect Israeli democracy and, you know, going over to minority rights where, you know, Arab Israelis and other minorities, communities usually aren't part of the military?
Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. So at least from my vantage point, you actually, so there's one complication, right? One complication is that because you do have conscription in Israel, obviously not for everybody, because you do have conscription, you know, a huge percentage of the population has military experience, which is not the case here. And I think that makes it a little more complicated because you often find that, you know, every Israeli is a military expert, right? They did their service, and so they know best. But I actually do think that there's a fair degree of healthy civilian oversight of the military in Israel. I mean, we see it play out in all sorts of ways, including now where the security establishment and the IDF have very strong opinions about what should be done in Gaza, in the West Bank. Oftentimes those opinions conflict with what the political leadership wants, and the political leadership wins out. I mean, I don't think that Yisrael Katz, the defense minister, I don't think that his views on things are particularly popular among many of the high-ranking IDF officers, but they're not going to go around him. You know, they try to find ways to work within the boundaries, but you know, I do think that civilian oversight of the IDF, to me, remains pretty strong. In some ways, I would actually argue that what we've seen over the past few years is too much civilian oversight, and that's particularly in the West Bank, where you have Bezalel Smotrich, who is both the finance minister, but also a minister in the defense ministry. He has now created an entire civilian apparatus within the military to oversee Israeli settlement activity inside of the West Bank. The West Bank is a military occupation. It should be under the auspices of the military. When it's not, that's when you run into even larger and thornier problems, you know, not just with the day-to-day of how a military occupation is carried out, but in terms of its actual status. And here we have a situation where things that should be under the direct purview of the military are now being moved to the purview of civilians and turning a military situation into a civilian one. So in that sense, actually, there's part of me that would like to see less civilian involvement in the IDF. But I think in general, from where my vantage point here, 6,000 miles away, there seems to be a decent balance between civilian and military in terms of oversight.
Thank you. Dahlia, please.
I just want to add a quick comment about that maybe we haven't really focused on enough, which I agree with you. There is lots of civilian oversight over the military, but I think that what you're mentioning, which is that there's this dangerous situation now where the occupation powers that have been the purview of the military are now being taken over by civilian institutions, and this is a form of annexation in a way. But it sort of obfuscates the reality, and this goes a little beyond your question, that the military occupation, Israel has tried to portray it over the years for international purposes as some sort of a separate entity with this regime that is not really connected to Israel's government and state, not really related to the Israeli democracy, which may have flaws, but this is a separate, entity. I think that that's really a mischaracterization. I mean, from the earliest weeks, practically, of the occupation after 1967, you almost immediately had, let's say, emergency legislation that was very quickly ratified by the Knesset, the legislature, the civilian legislature. Very quickly, within months after the occupation began, you have the Supreme Court hearing cases related to the West Bank. So you have the judiciary involved. Now you have, at this point, a long list of laws that have been passed by Knesset that effectively help to bring versions of Israeli law that are too complicated to explain into Israeli citizens living in the occupied territories. Of course, all the ministries that are involved in the infrastructure in the West Bank and, when there were settlements in Gaza, transportation ministry, agriculture ministry, communications ministry, every ministry of finance, these are all parts of the civilian executive branch. So I think we have to understand if we're analyzing democracy such as it is in Israel, I don't think we can we can't tell ourselves anymore that there's a separate occupation regime. It's part of the Israeli state. The Israeli citizens live all over the West Bank. There's no geographic distinction. And we have to be honest and analyze it as a matter of the relationship between the state and everybody that it falls under its control.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Yehuda Kurtzer from the Shalom Hartman Institute. Thank you all for your insights. My question is for Dr. Alper specifically. I'm curious about shifting attitudes, especially among young Americans, Jews notwithstanding, as relates to democracy itself and the principles of liberal democracy. And I'm curious, especially because the conventional wisdom for a long time was, young American Jews are distancing from Israel because they're kind of pro-liberal democracy here and they don't see it in Israel. But my sense is, not seeing or knowing the data, but my sense is that there's increasing hostility towards liberal democracy among young Americans in general in very different ways from both the left and the right. So I'm curious what you're seeing about those shifts and how it might impact this conversation.
That's a very good question. I'll just kind of say outright that, so my expertise is in studying religion in the US, and I focused on Jews and a few other groups other times. So I actually don't know much about views about democracy at all. That's the honest answer. But I will say that, you know, for young Jews and how their views of Israel are different from older Jews, we've seen that not just recently since October 7th, but we've also seen that preceding that time. So in our 2020 survey of U.S. Jews, we saw that gap happening in terms of a host of things that we asked about in terms of views of Jews and views of, it was kind of a broad question, but views of Netanyahu at the time. And so the best I can say is that this gap has, between older and younger Jews, it's persisted for a bit of time. That's the best I can offer you.
Thank you. Somebody on this side? Yes, please.
Hi, is this on? Okay, my name is Norm Kurz. My question arises from the comment about the absence of the political class accepting the diversity within Israel. I remember back to 1999, the first election which you voted, when in his acceptance speech, Ehud Barak spoke about all the different elements of Israeli society. It was a little bit mocked when he referred to the Circassians even. And so he talked about all, and of course this was all put to an end by the Second Intifada. And so I'm wondering what you think about that moment in time when it appeared that the liberal side of Israel was emerging and now in power, and what might have been, not in terms of relations with the Palestinian community so much as internally within Israel, and that effort that seemed to be not beginning but flowering toward greater acceptance of different minorities inside the country.
I'm happy to, but
Gadeer, sorry.
I believe we touched that in the way of any country must understand that implementing inclusive policy and embracing diversity in all levels, up, bottom, public, private sector, is one of the powerful tools to thrive. And researchers found that, history taught us that. But I'm afraid, as we mentioned, we are heading toward the different direction, toward nationalism, Jewishness, which is wrong. If we seek to stay a regional superpower, a high-tech empire, a democracy, an island of stability, we need to embrace that. But demographically, in 2060, we are going to have 30% of our legislators ultra-Orthodox. How that is going to affect that policy, how that is going to affect legislations. You know, the series of legislations that we are witnessing, you know, we mentioned Arbell. Did you see the communication law? Changing totally. Karai, the Minister of Communication, introduced recently a reform in the communication field to change the whole process of broadcasting in Israel. Controlling contents, controlling appointments, like the Eastern European, or you would imagine an authoritarian regime introducing that. You wouldn't even imagine that it's happening in Israel. So I am afraid that the direction is totally different.
My real point is that there was this moment, and it was rooted with the Second Intifada.
Yeah.
That there is, yes, it's on Israel for the fact that it has not, been inclusive as much as it should. But, history might have been very different but for the Second Intifada, and how Israel might have developed in a different way.
The question is, where is your 0 point? I can take you back to Hamahpach in the 70s. I can take you to the 90s, to Ehud, to Rabin and the regional approach and peace and love. Yes, we understand that this is the right direction that must be implemented, but I am afraid influenced by demographic components, by political, by personal components. Allow me, I don't know if you watched the documentary, The Bibi Files. Go and watch it. And for me, the visuals of having 4 Israeli officers, investigators, standing in front of an active prime minister and asking tough questions, This is going back to the democracy. This is the democracy that we are somehow grieving. So it's related to so many layers of questions about who are we, tough questions. It's beyond the 1999 Ehud Barak. There's so many positive signals through history since our establishment, but I am afraid we are not there anymore, my friend.
Please. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Lucia Fischel. I'm a former student of Dr. Lauren Strauss. And Dahlia, I had another question for you. I really appreciated your analysis that less than it being like a deep state takeover, the judiciary is what seems to be strength is actually the reverse. It's the, I believe you said like institutional lack of foregrounding, the neglect of the Knesset. And you've given a few reasons why that might be, but I just wanted to kind of like return to that initial analysis. Why do you think the Knesset has neglected like institutional foregrounding for citizens such that they've now turned to the judiciary?
Well, this is really opening up a lot of layers, but I think it's beyond just any one Knesset. Again, it goes back to the symbolic aspect of a lack of a constitution. The reason why Israel's first constitutional assembly declined to pass a constitution, there were numerous reasons, but I would say that I really summarize it as a reluctance, even a refusal to answer those critical questions that I mentioned earlier. What is the nature of civil liberties, human rights, but particularly the role of equality between all citizens? Is Israel willing to guarantee equality of all citizens, a fundamental aspect that is usually in the preamble of most constitutions, including the constitutions that define a national identity, right? Because a lot of the current government or the Israeli right wing will say, we passed the nation state law, and it's okay because Germany is the state of the German people, and the French is, Spain is the country of the Spanish. So what's the difference? The difference is that all of those constitutions in the very next line say all of our citizens are equal. Israel has not wanted to openly commit to that in a legally binding document. It has also not wanted to commit to defining the source of authority as either people or God. Why? Because it wanted the religious parties always on its side, the government, right, starting with Ben-Gurion. And that's partly the bargain against not wanting to give institutional power to Arab parties. So we have to depend on the religious parties. Therefore, we're going to not make decisions that upset them. And the third thing, I think, not every constitution does this, but all states do, and that is define their borders. And borders are critical from a constitutional perspective because you have to know where the country's jurisdiction starts and ends. And Israel has never wanted to do that. No government of Israel, not Ben-Gurion, not Benjamin Netanyahu, because they want the option of expanding. Ben-Gurion too. I mean, the partition was a compromise. We know this from lots of historic research done. It was a compromise, and maybe it was a pragmatic and valuable compromise for the establishment of the state, but the country's Zionist leadership didn't love it, and by many accounts were sort of waiting for the day that they could change those borders. And of course, even the partition borders were immediately changed during the War of Independence as Israel conquered additional territories. You might know that, but maybe I doubt most people know this, but the legal system that undergirds the military occupation that began after 1967 in the newly conquered territories was developed about 3 years earlier by then military advocate general Meir Shamgar, who later became a Supreme Court judge apropos civilian-military relations, whoever asked that question, right? We have a revolving door of legal figures that come from the military to the civilian infrastructure. So these are the kinds of questions that you would have to answer. And the government doesn't want to answer, no government has wanted to answer them, no Knesset has wanted to answer them. And as a result, it's turned into a cynical game. Instead of answering those questions, push them to the courts. Then later on, as the populist kind of political trend takes over, blame the courts for being too activist and stepping in and generating policy that is controversial and should be done by the lawmakers who won't do them. And that does also get back to your question a little bit, because even in a counterfactual where there might have been an ongoing peace process, which is very, very intimately linked with the question of whether Israel could have moved in a liberal direction. And I advocate, I argue in my book, I think the analysis is convincing that there's a very close link between those. However, we do see this illiberal, nationalist, populist attack on liberal democratic institutions around the world, not only in weak democracies or transitional democracies, but in long-established democracies. So we have to also take that into account. It could have affected Israel too. regardless, if you could somehow magically neutralize the issue of the conflict and occupation.
Yeah, so we have kind of 10 minutes left or so, and I wanted to take a few questions at a time, if that's possible. So
please raise your hand. I know we
raise
have
your
several
hand and I'll
questions.
come
Oh,
to
yo,
you.
yo, yo, yo. Okay, so we're gonna maybe, what, 3 at a time?
Yeah, 3 at a time, yeah.
Thank you. Just an elaboration on an issue you've been grappling with, and that is the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. The men don't work, they don't pay taxes, and they keep increasing demands on the budget. Related to that is they don't serve in the military, with a few exceptions. How is that issue going to play out? It seems to me it relates to the economic viability of the country going forward.
Yes, go ahead. Norman?
Norman Goldstein. With the state of politics in Israel and the fact that the latest poll indicated that no matter what the government would be, the choice of the people would still be Bibi Netanyahu, the only one in whom they have confidence as a leader, do you see the possibility of anyone arising in the foreseeable future to lead Israel along the paths that we are all hoping and aspiring to based on the conversation today?
I think this is for Dahlia. I'm curious how Israelis actually define democracy.
So why don't we start, Dahlia?
Well, how Israelis define democracy? Ironically, I've probably done 1,000 polls in my life, and I've read 1,000 more. And I don't think there's a question of how do you define democracy. But in focus groups, for example, I remember very clearly, actually particularly focus groups among the Arab community in Israel, they would say, how can it be democracy if there's no equality, right? Equality for the Arab community, that's the definition of democracy. And for Israelis, for Israeli Jews, if I had to kind of characterize it, I think they would say, well, I don't know, really, because it's changed, because there's been such a very concerted attempt from so many different layers of society, from the top political levels to the top political commentators to many of the civil society figures on the right wing, to redefine democracy as majority rule, the will of the majority of the public unconstrained. And that is expressed through the executive, which means the executive has to have all the power. So there are a growing number of Israelis, I can say, who would define it like that. And those numbers are probably around 40%. Why do I say 40%? Because that's the baseline who are supporting the government, who are voting for the parties of the coalition in every survey, between 38 and 42% roughly. Or let's say 38 to 42% roughly who support Netanyahu, maybe 42 to 43% who are supporting the parties of the coalition. And these are parties that have been saying for, again, roughly, I'm going to say 15 years, from 2009-10, when they really began hammering home this idea that democracy is the will of the majority, unconstrained. The only institution that expresses that is the executive, well, let's say the Knesset, but there's not such a separation. Anything else, whether it's the legal system, whether it's civil society, NGOs, universities, media, they're all against democracy. And that is a very, very conscious effort. Now, all the rest of Israeli society, so you could say roughly the 60% who, for example, oppose the judicial overhaul, whether they're on the left or the right, okay, they're going to say democracy means checks and balances, right? Democracy means both majority rule and civil liberties and, and human rights and restrictions on the power of the state and the power of the majority. And democracy means individual rights, something that's always had a bit of a mixed history in Israeli society, in Israeli political culture. And freedom, they might even say freedom. There's not really a consensus view right now. I think a lot of also that if I look at that broad 60%, they might also say, well, it means a Jewish majority. So, that's a reality too. Democracy has always been shot through with Jewish nationalism in Israel. Other questions, the Haredim. I think that the draft issue is a constant source of coalition instability. It's always, one of the main aspects that brings down Israeli governments because of the, irreconcilable positions that they don't want to be drafted, and the Israeli society and the Supreme Court has required it. But economically, I wouldn't count on that collapsing the country just yet, right, for various reasons.
Gadeer, you wanted to talk about, is Bibi ever going to be replaced?
You keep the tough questions for me. As a minority woman, thank you, Dan, my neighbor. Let me start with your question about the drafting law. During the war, since October 7th, IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, lost 916 soldiers who were killed in the war. More than 12,000 were injured. Some of them were injured twice. So there is a lack currently at IDF of 10,000 soldiers. It ignited very active public discussion that the pre-existence or reality October 7th and after October 7th, that everyone must be on board. There are very fierce demonstrations, pro, against, but for sure their leaders are tired from the promises of Prime Minister Netanyahu. You should listen to the leakage, to the videos and records that if this government, the full right government that you promised us that will protect us as an allies, as an ultra-Orthodox leaders, is not providing or delivering what we demand, which is a very soft version of a drafting law that is not satisfying rather the public or IDF demands. So let us go to an election, early election. From Netanyahu's point of view, what I think would happen is taking to distract somehow public opinion, to less focus on domestic political problems, the drafting law, and take us toward regional agreements or achievements. As you know, this week we have MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi ruler, prime minister here in the US. There is a huge pressure to put them in an agreement in the triangle of Israel, US, and Israel to normalize with Israel. So maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu would go to the next election with massive achievement. I less think in terms of realistic demands. Let's see if Saudi Arabia will sign kind of an agreement, but at least he will try to sign agreements with other Arab/Muslim countries, maybe Indonesia, Islamabad, Oman, kind of security agreement with Syria, but at least he will try to take Israelis toward the region. Let's touch the hot potato of the drafting law. Regarding the question of my friend Norman, it seems by every poll that Bennett is the new star, but there are some concerns that he will suffer from Bennett syndrome version 2, that he will collapse because in the election of 21, every poll gave him 20 plus, but in the results it was 6 mandates. So we need to follow up and see.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Hi, quick question. Over here. Hi, Ethan McMahon. I'm with the Dutch Shalom Congregation. Just a quick response about the impacts of 2 big things. One is that there's been so much continued popular marches and so on against the government. This seems like a long sustained issue that's kind of unusual. Second thing is the economic and potentially political isolation of Israel, from the kind of the Sparta speech to this idea we have to go it alone, and others saying you have to go alone.
Okay. I'm going to actually ask a question, take the prerogative. I want to take us back sort of a more aspect of all of this, which is you are all so fluent in figures and statistics, and have a leading pollster here, Becka, Alper, and actually later going to hear from another one, Shmuel Rosner from the Israeli side, and also Dahlia. I'm wondering, when all of these figures that have been cited, how do you frame questions? I mean, the way that these questions are framed elicit certain answers. So I'm wondering about the whether it's possible to have a totally apolitical or some kind of benign questioning that elicits figures that are totally accurate. So I'm wondering, Becka, how you do that, and also Michael, you also are in this world.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So just kind of background for those who don't know about Pew Research Center. We're a purely nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. So we really strive to be neutral and impartial in how we approach all topics. And so I study religion in the US, but we have people who study politics and race and ethnicity, and we have a whole team that studies things globally, from politics to religion to everything in between. And the way we ask questions deeply matters. It's not just what we ask, but when we ask it, where it appears in the survey, who we ask it to. And so I'll kind of just tell you a little bit about the story of how we did our survey in February 2024, when it was really a survey exploring the Israel-Hamas war. And so it's a fraught topic to ask about, especially in February 2024. We're planning for it. We started maybe late November, early December. It was a unexpected pivot for us, as it probably was for lots of folks, because you didn't know a war was going to happen. And so basically, so we do a lot of different things to ask quality questions. One is that, so we work as a team. So we have lots of people working on these things all the time to just kind of get a sense of balance and perspective. So everything is a team effort. But one thing we do, especially, we don't do it consistently, but we definitely do it for things we don't usually ask about, or difficult topics, or things we don't know too much about, is we'll test our questions. And that is definitely something we did for our survey in February 2024, where we came up with a bunch of different questions we wanted to ask about the war, and a host of specific subtopics. So we asked about views, we asked about, incidents related to discrimination, we asked about free speech issues. And for all of those, it really depends on how you ask it. So even deciding to call it the Israel-Hamas war, we weren't sure if that was the appropriate term at the time to describe what was happening. And for us, one of our big objectives is to be kind of a mirror to the public. So we want to reflect what people know and understand and see. And so part of our testing was, how should we talk about this? Like, how are people understanding what's going on? And so even that choice was a reflection of asking people where they're at, how they understand what's going on at that time. And it's, to be in the weeds, it's just a lot of wordsmithing questions to get things right. You don't want them to be biased or unbalanced. So for us, it's a lot of asking things for that topic among a range of groups. So it's not just asking about views about Israel, but it's asking about views of like the Israel state or Israel government, Israeli people, but also Palestinian government or leadership and its people, and capturing both sides of that dynamic. It was also important for us to, this is very much in the weeds of surveys, but as Jews are 2% of the US population, Muslims are 1%. It's very tricky to ask about Arab identity. Like, it's hard to capture in a question in a way that people understand what you're asking. We want to at least try and capture views of Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans, so we oversampled those groups, so we had enough statistical power. We just had enough people to talk about in a responsible and meaningful way. So there's also efforts to represent those viewpoints. And even things like the order in which you ask a question, like the order of those, like you can prime people to think a certain way about topics depending on the order you give them those questions. And so we think about all of those things, and importantly, we think about all those things when we ask those questions again, because if you ask, say, a sensitive question at the end of a survey all about a given topic, they're going to be thinking about it a certain way. And then if you suddenly ask that question at the beginning of the survey the next time, you're probably going to get a different read. And so it's establishing kind of a baseline and kind of consistently asking these questions such that you're kind of accounting for those patterns and how people are thinking about the questions you ask them in the order that you're giving them. Hopefully that all made sense.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to?
I'll quickly tackle the question about isolation. I think there's a lot of angst over regional normalization and what's happening with Saudi Arabia and other countries. And, the war in Gaza and the aftermath and the way the proverbial day after is shaping up is going to make it impossible at the moment for the Saudis to normalize with Israel. But the military-to-military relations between Israel and countries in the region has basically continued unabated over the last 2.5 years. I think that's going to continue. That's actually not where I'd be worried if I were the Israeli government. I'd be worried about the United States. People may have seen just over the past couple of days, there's discussion about the next U.S.-Israel memorandum of understanding on security assistance. The current 10-year one expires in 2 years. It was 10 years, $38 billion, and Israeli officials are now throwing out numbers like 20 years. They want to take it to 2048 and the 100th anniversary of Israel, and they want the number to be larger annually. And it makes me worried that Israeli officials don't grasp what's going on here, where both on the right and on the left, Israel has taken a big hit. It's going to continue to take a big hit. It's for different reasons. But if we look at the three basic sources of support for Israel in this country, the idea that supporting Israel is in our national interest, the idea that supporting Israel plays into our shared values, and just popular opinion that drives some of foreign policy, all three of those are under assault in real ways. And that didn't end with the end of the Gaza war. So if I were Israel, that's what I'd be most worried about, and I'd be thinking now about how to reverse some of that damage.
I think it's a good time to end the conversation. I want to please join me in thanking the panelists.